It's not working. That's the problem.
Okay.
So sorry, sir.
No worries, no worries. It
Sorry.
happens. Whenever technology is involved, it happens.
Yes, yes, yes.
So looking at your title, the one which you had given topic, then I thought probably then I went back to Gayatri Chakrabarti's Vibhak and then I chose that for yesterday's quotation.
Okay.
So I thought
Okay,
probably you
okay.
would have got it only from there. So what made you, get interested in comparative literature?
Well, I taught comparative literature for about 8 years. So that is definitely one of the reasons.
Okay.
And yeah, the interdisciplinary, character of comparative literature is very interesting.
Oh.
So,
Do you also take up work as a translator?
yeah, I do.
Okay, from Malayalam to English?
From Malayalam to English, from English to Malayalam,
Okay.
Chinese to English.
Oh.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, and little bit of other languages as well, little bit of Sanskrit.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, Professor Ram.
Ma'am, I think the problem is solved, ma'am. Now you can go live, ma'am.
Okay, okay. So
So you
can
may
we?
continue, sir.
Okay, are we online?
Yes, sir. We are online, sir. Your thing is being screened, sir.
Okay, okay,
You
my
may
dear
continue,
friends, sorry for the technical glitch. Now, I was telling you about my title, but before that, I want to tell you another thing. I will not be using any PowerPoint presentation in this lecture. I will be quoting some writers, I will be having some quotations, I will be having some citations, and you might want to write them down, but it won't be practical to dictate those things. So what I will do is at the end of the lecture, I will provide a transcript of the major quotations and citations with the organizers, and they will share it with you. So coming back to the title, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak's 2003 publication, Death of a Discipline. That is where this lecture takes its title from. Now, I am going to tell a sad story. If Shakespeare were to tell a sad story, we would call that a tragedy. He was a dramatist, and when he told a sad story, we called it a tragedy. For example, Hamlet. The full title of Hamlet is The Tragical History of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. Or think about Christopher Marlowe, his Dr. Faustus. Students preparing for NET have to study the full title. So they know Dr. Faustus, the full title of this particular play is The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. Now, if I were a dramatist, and if this lecture were a play, I would have titled this lecture as The Tragical History of the Life, Death, and Spectral Rebirth of Comparative Literature. Of course, Dr. Shivram in his introduction was giving you a brief idea as to what comparative literature is. We all know what comparative literature is. We are doing a lot of comparative studies. But what exactly is comparative literature? How can we articulate it? Before going further into comparative literature as such, I would briefly want you to look at the word comparison. What is comparison? What is the purpose of comparison? There is a game that kids play. They would come to you with a piece of paper and they would draw a line with a pencil on the piece of paper, and they would ask you, Uncle, could you please shorten this line without touching it? You can use the pencil, but not the eraser. You cannot use the rubber or the eraser, but you can use the pencil. Can you shorten this line without touching it? Of course, they expect a reply that you can't. So you will say, no, of course we can't. And so what they will do is they will be very happy that we don't know. And then they will show you how to do it. What they will do is they will draw a longer line next to this line. And then they will say, see, uncle, see, this line has become short. So what are they saying? See, comparison, right? They're doing comparison, and something can be defined or explained or qualified better in other terms when we do some sort of comparison. Ezra Pound, we know Ezra Pound as an imagist poet. We know him as a great 20th century poet and thinker, and a person with whose life was enmeshed in a lot of controversy. I don't know if you are familiar with the Ezra Pound, who is a comparatist, who was involved in comparative literature. Actually, there is one school of thought that believed that Ezra Pound was the first theorist and the first active practitioner of comparative literature. One school of thought believed like that. They also believed that his version of comparative literature was the panacea, the solution, the cure for the problems ailing comparative literature. So Ezra Pound made a very interesting statement in his book, ABC of Reading. He says, you cannot judge any chemical's action merely by putting it with more of itself. You have sulfuric acid, concentrated sulfuric acid. If you add more of sulfuric acid into that, nothing will happen, and you will get no idea as to how this will act or react. But if you pour some water into concentrated sulfuric acid, there will be a blast. So what Ezra Pound says, you cannot judge any chemical's action merely by putting it with more of itself. Think about it. So you need to juxtapose something with something else to judge or to say something more about something. So this is one simple way in which we can understand comparative literature. And in post-colonial theory, they speak about the other, and they say that the self can be understood only in juxtaposition with the other. You have a self, but to explain that self, to define that self, you need an other. It was Hegel who said so. So everywhere we need some juxtaposition, some comparison to make sense of something, to make meaning, to have a meaning or a way to define and explain something. We need some sort of comparison. That was why René Descartes, René Descartes, I'm sure, the Cartesian philosopher who is best known for his, the statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, the French philosopher. So René Descartes said something very beautiful about comparison. He said, it is only by way of comparison that we know the truth precisely. Knowing the truth. Living in a postmodern, post-structuralist world, We may not believe in ideals of truth, but he lived at a time when people believed in truth. And he said that the best way to know the truth is by way of comparison. Think about it. So, with this brief introduction to comparison, we will move on to comparative literature. What is comparative literature? Etymologically, the term comparative literature means any literary work that compares. Any literary work that compares is comparative literature. And the simple way to define comparative literature would be to say that it is a comparison between two literatures. Indian literature versus American literature, Canadian literature. It's a comparison between two literatures, but it doesn't have an independent status. You call it a literature, but it is a comparison. It is comparison, and so it doesn't have an independent status. It analyzes similarities and differences between literatures. And I will give you one or two very useful definitions of comparative literature. The first definition I want to give is from Henry Lee Mack. You know, he was a great comparatist belonging to the American School of Comparative Literature. So he said in his book, I am quoting, in his book, Comparative Literature, Method and Perspective, published in 1961, Henry Lee Mack, R-E-M-A-K, he says this, he defines comparative literature like this. He says, comparative literature is the study of literature beyond the confines of one particular country, crossing borders beyond the boundaries of a country, and the study of the relationship between literature on the one hand and other areas of knowledge and belief, say arts, philosophy, history, social sciences, religion, whatever. In brief, he says, comparative literature is the comparison of one literature with another or others, and the comparison of literature with other spheres of human expression. Okay, so we get some idea what is comparative literature. We got some of the major terms involved in comparative literature. I'll give you one more very short definition. It is by Sandra Burman, B-E-R-M-A-N-N. She says, comparative literature juxtaposes literary texts from different languages and cultures. Different languages, different cultures. And the word is juxtaposes, place side by side with something. It connects. She uses another word, connects. Say, a poem with a dance, a film with the novel, photography with the essay. So we have certain key terms, and maybe we can have a working definition of comparative literature to proceed with our lecture. So comparative literature, from whatever we have discussed so far, we can safely say comparative literature is an interdisciplinary field. Yeah, its practitioners study literature across borders. Across what all borders? Across national borders, across time periods, across languages, across genres, across boundaries between literature and other arts, music, painting, film, dance, whatever, across disciplines, literature and psychology, literature and philosophy, science, history, architecture, you name it. Defined most broadly, comparative literature then is the study of literature without borders. Literature, but how many times we have seen this word beyond, moving beyond boundaries. So going beyond what? National boundaries. So don't think narrow. That is what they say. We don't want what they say. We don't want any narrow provincial parochial sentiments. Go beyond narrow national boundaries, and they have an interest in languages. Philology, knowing different languages. It's the pleasure of a comparatist to be a philologist, a bilingual or a philologist, so that they can read foreign texts in their original form. So this is one way in which we can understand comparative literature. Now, without further ado, I would take you to this tragical story of the life, death, life of the birth, the life, the death, and the spectral reincarnation of comparative literature. So comparative literature, when you look at the history of comparative literature, people say that comparative literature had its beginnings in the West, in Western civilization. Indian comparative literature is of very recent origin, and I won't be going much into Indian comparative literature today because we are doing it from a different perspective today. So, people would generally put the beginning of comparative literature, they would peg it to 1827, when Goethe, the German writer, the famous German writer, he spoke about Welt literature or world literature. But I want to point out something very interesting that happened a few decades earlier. In 1785, something happened in India. A person, Charles Wilkins, he translated the Bhagavad Gita, the holy text, the holy scripture, the Bhagavad Gita into English in 1785. And he requested, the first Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, to write a foreword to his translation. In this foreword, what Warren Hastings does is something that interests us. He says he pleads for a comparative study of Gita, Bhagavad Gita on the one hand, and the European works of great merit. His idea was this, I'm not going into quotations. He said something like this. He said, in India, we have the Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata is being translated into English. And Warren Hastings says, I have great regard for the masterpieces of Western literature, say the Iliad or the Odyssey, and I have great reverence. I venerate John Milton for his Paradise Lost, but I also feel that we should study the translations of Mahabharata along with our Milton and our Virgil and our Homer. Of course, he is not speaking about comparative literature, but isn't he thinking about literature beyond boundaries, literature beyond borders? See, across cultural exchange is happening. Literature from India being compared to ancient literature from Greece, juxtaposing, placing side by side with Milton. So there are grains of comparative literature in what he said. Now let us come back to what Goethe said in 1827. Goethe spoke of Welt literature, world literature. It can be translated as world literature. And it is considered to be the beginning of comparative literature, Goethe's proposition of Welt literature. And what does this proposition mean? When Goethe spoke about Welt literature or world literature, it indicated the availability or circulation of literary texts from different nations, different cultures, different languages to other parts of the world. So, if you want a world literature, you need literary text being produced in other parts of the world. You need it, you want to get it, and you should be able to read it. So probably Goethe also had in mind the idea of translation. because only when we get to translate, we will be able to understand, a foreign tongue. So aesthetically, Goethe's formulation signals the recognition of literary features of universal significance, universal values. This is very important in comparative literature. So when you speak about world literature, what is it? It says that you can find comparisons between similarities between literatures written in different parts of the world. In other words, there are universals. Okay? And the conception of wealth literature or world literature can be considered to be in contrast or opposed to the concept of national literature. Goethe didn't speak about national literature. He spoke about world literature. He was asking his fellow Germans and maybe fellow Europeans too to read other literatures produced in other countries. And definitely he had an interest in translation. I would quote just one sentence from Goethe. He says, Goethe has this to say: "It is becoming more and more obvious to me that poetry is the common property of all mankind, signaling universal values." And then in 1848, Matthew Arnold, you're familiar with Matthew Arnold, and he has got something to do with comparative literature. I'm sure you might have noticed when he spoke about touchstone method, there is something, some eerie connection with comparative literature, or when he defined criticism, the function of criticism at the present time, there he defines criticism as a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought, the best that is known and thought in the world. So this man Matthew Arnold always had this idea of world literature, global citizen. And Matthew Arnold, he was a teacher and a preacher. So 1848, he was giving the inaugural lecture as professor of poetry at Oxford, baptized comparative literature. In other words, credited with coining the English word comparative literature. And he says, everywhere there is connection, everywhere there is illustration, connections, illustrations. No single event, no single comprehended except in its relation to other events, to other literatures. To understand a literature, you have other literatures, Arnold says. And he continues, we must compare. What is the purpose? The works of other ages with those of our own age and country. For what? To know how we stand, that we may know, to know how others stand, so that we may know how we ourselves stand. In other words, to judge ourselves, we have to first know what others are doing. We have to first know others. So Arnold spoke about comparative literature. And the term comparative literature was coined by Matthew Arnold in 1848. 1827, Goethe, wealth literature. 1848, Matthew Arnold, the English term comparative literature. And soon, this idea of comparative literature spread throughout the globe. And three major schools of comparative literature emerged. Three major schools. The French school of comparative literature, the German school of comparative literature, and comparative literature. First, the French school. See, when you look at the French school, comparative literature as an academic discipline of a cross-disciplinary character, where is the tragedy? When we trace the history of comparative literature, what we find instead is a history of violent debate. There were arguments for and against comparative literature. What is the problem? What is the problem? In 1903, Benedetto Croce argued that comparative literature was a non-subject. non, N-O-N, not K-N-O-W-N. He said that comparative literature was a N-O-N, non-subject. What is he saying? He contemptuously dismissed the idea that comparative literature is a discipline in its own right, questioning the very identity of comparative literature. He argued that there is no study more arid than researches of this sort, more arid, very dry, very boring. He said that comparative literature is utterly boring, terrible. And he suggested that the proper object of study, instead of comparison, it should be we should be thinking about literary history. He argued that the term comparative literature had no substance to it. Very bad. No, he was saying it did not exist. It is obfuscatory. It doesn't mean anything. And then he says it had no substance to it. Lane Cooper, another critic, he says comparative literature is a bogus term, a fake term that makes neither sense nor syntax. What he was saying was any person with some sense would not do comparative studies. So there were a lot of problems.
May I excuse, sir?
Yes, sir.
Sir, is your network properly working, sir? Because we have some glitch over here.
Yeah, it is working. I guess it is, yeah.
Because here we do not get the audio, sir. So can you just switch off your microphone and just switch it on, sir?
Yeah, sure. Is it fine?
Give me a sec, sir. Give me a second, sir.
Yeah, sure.
I think we can continue. People say now it is clear.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir. Thank
Okay.
you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so I was saying about two critics who spoke vociferously against comparative literature. Benedetto Croce, who said that comparative literature is a non-subject, that it is very dry and that it had no substance to it, and Lane Cooper, who described comparative literature as senseless and syntaxless and as a bogus term. There were many critics in this group who argued against comparative literature. On the other hand, many scholars made very grand claims for comparative literature. Charles Mills Gailey, for example, in the same 1903 that Benedetto Croce said that it was a useless thing, Charles Mills Gailey said that the working premise of the student of comparative literature was a common institutional expression of humanity. A common institutional expression of humanity. What a great way of defining something. And in India in 1907, Rabindranath Tagore spoke about Vishwa Sahitya, world literature, very similar to what Goethe said in 1827, wealth literature. Tagore says about Vishwa Sahitya, world literature. He contrasts it with Gramya Sahitya, Gramya versus Vishwa, national literature versus world literature. So people like Rabindranath Tagore were supporting comparative literature, while some others were saying very bad things about comparative literature. Strong arguments for and against comparative literature. Anyway, so the growth of comparative literature got a little stunted now. Slowly, comparative literature consolidated its position as an academic discipline, thanks to something that happened in an altogether different sphere, in politics. What happened? There was the World War, 1914 to 1918. There was the First World War, and the US President Woodrow Wilson came up with the vision of one world. One world. One world, one literature, world literature. Yeah. So it was this vision of one world propounded by Woodrow Wilson helped comparative literature a great deal to establish itself as an academic discipline, because it was something like this one world vision that comparative literature also proposed, world literature. when we look at the history of human civilization, we find that such idealistic visions recur whenever there is a major international crisis. For example, we are in an international crisis, the global pandemic, and that has brought us all together. See, had there been no corona, had there been no pandemic, we would never have been together today. What brought us together? A pandemic, an international crisis. So what I'm saying is, whenever there is an international crisis, in the aftermath of the crisis, we will find idealistic visions of unity and oneness, like the one world theory propounded by Woodrow Wilson. Or think about what happened after the Second World War. People didn't want a third world war. They saw all the troubles and all the misery of the wars, two world wars, and they wanted no more war. So the countries of the world strongly vouched for a United Nations Assembly. One World by Woodrow Wilson, United Nations Assembly. In politics, this happened in politics. And at the same time, something happened in comparative literature as well. When people were speaking about United Nations Assembly in comparative literature, two people, Rene Wellek and Austin Warren, in 1949, they came up with a monumental treatise titled Theory of Literature. A very great work in the history of English literature. So in that book, Rene Wellek and Austin Warren, they actually offered a cultural or literary equivalent to United Nations Assembly. In politics, there was this United Nations Assembly. In culture, Rene Wellek and Austin Warren suggested that we have comparative literature, and this comparative literature can be seen as a cultural equivalent to the United Nations Assembly. What great way of proposing comparative literature as a great thing. They depicted, Rene Wellek and Austin Warren, they depicted the comparatist as a comparison as a vocation, and the comparatist as a kind of United Nations ambassador for comparative literature. They said that literature and humanity are one, literature is one just as art and humanity are one. And they spoke about both a widening of perspectives and a suppression of local and provincial sentiments. Rene Wellek and Austin Warren suggesting comparative literature as the cultural equivalent of the United Nations Assembly. What great credit to comparative literature. And then Francois Jost, he said something even more interesting. He said that we should see comparative literature as some kind of world religion. This is what he says. I will quote. Francois Jost says this: comparative literature represents more than an academic discipline. It's not just an academic discipline, but much more than that. He says that it is an overall view of literature, of the world of letters, a humanistic ecology, and a literary Weltanschauung, a literary worldview, a vision of the cultural universe, inclusive and comprehensive, suggesting comparative literature as a kind of world religion. And the underlying suggestion here is that all cultural differences will disappear when a reader takes up great works of art. Here, art is seen as an instrument, as a vehicle of universal peace and harmony. And the comparatist is envisaged as one who facilitates that harmony. So what a great profession comparative literature comparison turned out to be, in the words of these people. And in 1954, I was speaking about Pound as a comparatist. In 1954, we witness the founding of the ICLA, International Comparative Literature Association, at Oxford University. institutionalization of comparative literature, right? So, and Ezra Pound was one of the founding fathers of ICLA, 1954. So suddenly everything is again starting to look very rosy for comparative literature, and it seemed like comparative literature had to just be there, and it will grow into one of the greatest disciplines ever. But no, unfortunately, no. Trouble was brewing for comparative literature. By the 1960s, people started speaking about the crisis of comparative literature. And there are two Renes, Rene Wellek and Austin Warren I was describing just a while back. So Rene Wellek and Rene Etiemble, two critics who especially spoke about the crisis in comparative literature. So what was this crisis that they were talking about? The problem was there was a lot of theorizing, but nobody was actually doing any comparison. Harry Levin sums up this crisis in these words. I'm quoting, we spend far too much of our energy talking about comparative literature and not enough of it comparing the literature. Lot of practical work, lot of theoretical work, but no practical action. He was exhorting the comparatists to stop theorizing and do some practical work. This was the crisis. Okay, so this is a tragedy, right? This is the tragedy of the life and death of comparative literature. And in Shakespeare's tragedies, we find interludes, comic interludes. I will have a short interlude as well, something that I want to connect with this lecture, but I want to briefly invite your attention to a particular movement that flourished in the 1950s. The Beat movement. I'm sure you are familiar with the Beat generation of the 1950s. It originally began as an underground anti-conformist youth movement in the US. We are familiar with some of the greatest works in Beat movement: Allen Ginsberg's Howl, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Howl was published in 1956. On the Road was published in 1957. And the central element of Beat culture was a rejection of existing narratives. It was a counter narrative. It rejected existing values, and something else was born out of this Beat movement: hippism, the hippie culture. Hippism, right? Hippism was, it was a counter-cultural movement that took inspiration from the Beat movement, obviously. It originated in the 1960s, it flourished in the 1970s, and it died in the 1980s, I guess. So the movement called hippism. Allen Ginsberg's works were central to the hippie culture. So what was the central tenets of hippism? They questioned everything. They rebelled against everything. They rebelled against established institutions. They criticized middle-class bourgeois values. They opposed the war. They opposed, they were against America's, war in Vietnam. They were against that. And they had some great things to say as well. They said that breastfeeding should be promoted at a time when mothers were, moving away from that. So they had something great, but normally there is a tendency to look at hippism as a very bad movement. They had a lot of things to do with drug abuse and sex and things like that. So we generally consider it as a bad movement. But what I want to say is something else. They were rebellious against institutions, values, orthodoxy. They considered peace, love, and personal freedom. They were very adamant that we want our freedom. And they saw the system as something that that suppressed their freedom. They perceived the dominant culture as a corrupt, monolithic entity that exercised undue power over their lives. And the hippie culture spread throughout the world through, rock, folk, psychedelic rock, the musics, the blues. Now, what I want to tell you is this hippie culture that came to prominence in the 1960s, hippism comprised mostly of teenagers and young adults between the age of 15 and 25. Young people, 15 to 25. And throughout the hippie movement, many hippie students were threatened of expulsion from universities. Many hippie students were suspended and later dismissed from colleges and universities for openly expressing their views. Now, we find a lot of students out of the university, right? Now, I want to take you back to our history of comparative literature. In the 1960s, what happened was high-flying graduate students in the 1950s and 60s, high-flying graduate students in the West turned to comparative literature as a radical subject because they found that comparative literature embodied the very values that they wanted. It was transgressive, it was radical, it crossed all boundaries. They wanted to jump out of the boundaries of existing systems, and comparative literature was doing just that. It was crossing all boundaries, it was transgressive, moving across the boundaries of single literature study. So these students, these youngsters, they embraced comparative literature most fondly in the 50s and 60s. They were not worried that there was no proper methodology for comparative literature. They were not worried about what the critics said about comparative literature, whether the subject existed or not. They were not worried about any of those things. They loved comparative literature. And so for the first time, comparative literature was having an extraordinary time in the academy. It became a pakka academic subject. But, comparative literature was ill-fated. The fault in the stars, maybe. What happened, just when comparative literature seemed to be making giant strides, flaws in the idea of universal values and of world literature were being explored in all parts of the world. What am I saying? The idea of universal values. We moved great waves of critical thought from structuralism to post-structuralism and deconstruction, swept through one after the other. And what happened? Earlier, we believed that there was meaning, and a text has a meaning, and a competent reader, a sahridaya, can reach that meaning if he does something in a certain way. So the author is the creator of the meaning. There is a fixed meaning in the text, and the reader can get that meaning if he is competent enough. This was the traditional belief. But with deconstruction and post-structuralism, with these movements, what happened was the idea that we can have a single harmonious reading, this idea was shattered forever. And the idea of universals started being questioned. People started questioning the idea of universals, universal values. And if there are no universals, comparative literature is in deep trouble. So this is what happened. So these theories came and comparative literature was overshadowed. The very foundational principles of comparative literature were proved wrong by these theories. And what happened? 1967, you know what happened? Derrida presented structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences. He published 3 books, one after the other, translated famously by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. And with all these, what happened was we reached a world of literary theory. And Just a while before, we were talking about how students thronged the universities to study comparative literature as a radical subject. But now students realize that no, comparative literature is not that radical. These theories are radical. So by the 1970s, a new generation of high-flying graduate students in the West had turned to literary theory, women's studies, cultural studies as radical subject choices, abandoning comparative literature. They abandoned comparative literature. Bye bye. Goodbye. Goodbye. They bade goodbye to comparative literature and they embraced literary theory. So comparative literature lost its place in the academy to literary theory. And you know what happened? In 1993, a very famous comparatist, Susan Basnet. You know, when we speak about comparative literature, we cannot explain it without recourse to Susan Basnet. She's a very famous comparatist. So in 1993, Susan Basnet published Comparative Literature, a Critical Introduction. Just think about it. We started discussing comparative literature since 1820s, and even after 170 years, what is the title of this book by Susan Basnet? Comparative Literature, a Critical Introduction. Oh my God, still taking baby steps, comparative literature. So in this book, I mean, Susan Basnet published this book, and comparative literature was very hopeful. Okay, finally, Susan Basnet will defend me. This is what comparative literature probably expected from Susan Basnet, but Susan Basnet had something else to say. She wanted to discuss the troublesome relationship between comparative literature and translation studies. You know what? While comparative literature was losing ground in the West, translation studies was gaining in popularity and strength. We know that comparative literature and translation studies are closely related. You know, comparison requires a lot of translation. Without translation, we cannot read foreign productions. So we know the connection between comparative literature and translation studies. And generally, it was believed that comparative literature was the major discipline, the bigger discipline, and translation studies was considered as a subcategory to comparative literature. But Susan Basnet said that this assumption will have to be questioned. Susan Basnet pointed out that we needed to reassess the relationship between comparative literature and translation studies. What is the problem? Why should we reassess? See, if comparative literature is the main discipline and if translation studies is the sub-discipline, but that was not how things was happening. Translation studies had developed to such an extent that there were many, in the 1990s, there were many who considered translation studies as a complete, full-fledged discipline in its own right. And it was very interdisciplinary. It derived from works in linguistics, literary study, history, anthropology, psychology, sociology, very interdisciplinary, intercultural. It had a sound scope. It had a clear methodology. It had clear meaning. It had a clear purpose. And comparative literature had none of these things. It didn't have a proper methodology. Its scope was being questioned. Its meaning was being questioned. Yes, it was intercultural, but it was unable, still making baby steps. And so, seen from this angle propounded by Susan Basnet, comparative literature began to appear less and less like a discipline and more like a subcategory, a branch of something else. You know, this had happened earlier also in the relationship between semiotics and linguistics. We know what semiotics is. It is the study of science, and linguistics is the scientific study of language. You know, there was a time when people thought that linguistics was the bigger category And semiotics was considered a subcategory to linguistics. But later it became very clear that it was not the case, that and it became very clear that linguistics was a sub-discipline of semiotics. The same happened to comparative literature with Susan Bassnett. With Susan Bassnett's this publication of this book, Comparative Literature, in 1993, comparative literature began to be seen increasingly as a subcategory of translation studies. Poor comparative literature. It lost its pride of place to translation studies. It was abandoned by the students, rejected, dejected, battered, bruised, torn, worn out, helpless. And then somebody had to just give the death certificate. And Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak did that in 2003. She published Death of a Discipline. I was alluding to that at the beginning of my lecture. So in the book, Death of a Discipline, Spivak declares the death of comparative literature as we know it. And she called for a new comparative literature. She named it, it's very interesting. She named the new comparative literature that she envisaged as comparative cultural studies. What is happening? Comparative literature died, and cultural studies, comparative cultural studies. Gayatri Spivak spoke about that. So I would say comparative literature died. When somebody died, what would we do? We have to do a postmortem. If it is a drama, if it is a play, if it is a tragedy, at the end of the play, we would start thinking about hamartia. What was it that led to the fall of the hero, the death of the hero? We speak about procrastination of Hamlet. We speak about sexual jealousy in Othello. All these things we know. Hamartia. Here, shouldn't we discuss about the hamartia, of comparative literature? Or I know it is 12, but the organizers have given me half an hour too. They have given me a free hand as well. They have told me that I can speak as long as there is somebody to listen. Definitely. So I will continue. So what I would like to do is to do a short post-mortem of comparative literature. What are the reasons for the untimely deaths of comparative literature? Reason number 1, lack of actual practice. I explained it earlier. What Harry Levin said, comparative literature only paid lip service to what Goethe said. They never practiced what they preached. In 1990, Earl Miner asserted that actual comparison is scarcely found in the work of comparatists. And even he says that, I'm quoting, comparatists do not talk about comparison. Just imagine. So there was no actual practice of comparison happening. This is one reason for the death of comparative literature. My second point is lack of a proper definition of its scope of comparative literature. As we know, comparative literature shared space with many other disciplines. It is very interdisciplinary. And because of that, whenever a comparative literature syllabus was being devised in a university, that syllabus would be drawn by scholars from different departments, not just English department, not less cultural. Scholars from different departments would draw the syllabus of comparative literature. So this eclecticism, drawing from different sources, deriving ideas from different sources, has led critics to argue that comparative literature is not well defined, that comparative literature is ill-defined, insufficiently defined, and that comparative studies will fall into dilettantism. Dilettantism. A dilettante is a person who is interested in, who seems interested, but who is not very interested, who is very shallow. So comparative literature was accused of shallowness because of its interdisciplinary nature. The third reason for comparative literature's death, lack of a proper methodology and purpose. You know what happened? The methods and aims of comparative literature have neither been unanimously accepted nor been spelt out. The comparatists adopt various methods. Some of them find out similarities between works. Some of them find out differences between works. And some of them found out both similarities and differences. And there entered comparison. Is that comparative study? No. We have to, yes, we will find similarities and differences when we do comparison, but a comparatist should not have stopped there. He should have asked the questions why and how. Why are there such differences? Why are there such similarities? When you compare a Malame, people as diverse as Malame with, say, Emily Dickinson, you will find a lot of similarities. So you have to ask the question. Just finding the similarities is not sufficient. The comparatist has to ask the question why. But this was not done by comparatists. So this lack of a proper methodology and purpose affected comparative literature. And my fourth point would be that the death of comparative literature was caused by the pressure exerted by vocational courses in the curriculum. I'm sure you will understand this. Vocational courses, parents, students, all of us want job-oriented courses. And comparative literature is a job-oriented. There was nothing about job orientation as far as comparative literature is concerned. There was no vocationality in comparative literature. And in literary studies, comparative literature was squeezed on the job-oriented courses. And because of this, again, nobody was studying comparative literature. The necessity for a more vocational approach, where both students and their parents were looking for job-oriented courses, meant that comparative literature had to make way for those vocational courses. So another reason for comparative literature for being ousted from the academy. And finally, my fifth point would be comparative literature's death was caused by the emergence of modern literary theories. I explained part of that, but I want to point out one more thing. I want to speak about the impact of post-colonialism very briefly. One of the seminal texts of post-colonialism, written by three people, Griffiths, Tiffin, and Ashcroft, The Empire Writes Back. What is the subtitle of that work? Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures. Now, let me ask you a question. Which discipline studies literatures? Comparative literature, right? And post-colonial studies, this seminal text of post-colonialism is subtitled Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures, encroaching into the sphere of comparative literature. And in that book, these authors, they say that the term post-colonial is most appropriate for the new cross-cultural criticism that has emerged in the recent years. The new cross-cultural criticism. So they defined post-colonialism as a cross-cultural criticism. Now, what is this cross-cultural criticism? Wasn't it the sphere of comparative literature? Well, a stronger contender came in the form of post-colonialism, and again, comparative literature surrendered. So, These 5 things, I would say, contributed to the demise of comparative literature. And finally, I would like to take you through the last part. What is the spectre? My lecture is titled Spectre of a Discipline. What is this spectral rebirth? In other words, I am trying to look at what happened in other parts of the world while comparative literature was dying in the West. What happened in the West versus what is happening in the rest of the world. You know what? The Western scholars of comparative literature, they studied European literatures, giving utmost importance to European values. They were very well aware of other literatures. They knew that there were other great literatures in the world outside the West, but because of their Eurocentric attitude, they never paid, maybe it was conscious, maybe it was unconscious, but they served Eurocentrism. The tastes and the values of Europe was given utmost prominence by the Europeans. And one of their prominent motives in literary study, in comparative study, one of the major motives of Western scholars was to establish the supremacy of Western culture over other cultures. You know what? We know about African culture, Asian culture, the Middle Eastern culture, literatures, African, Indian, Asian literature, Middle Eastern literature. They were all studied, maybe. If at all they were studied, they were relegated to the rubric of area studies. They weren't even given the pride of place of literary studies. The literature from Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, all these literatures were relegated to area studies, not literature studies. The European literatures were understood as the touchstone, as the great masterpieces of literature, as canonical, as aesthetic, and promoting universal values, while the texts from the non-West, from other parts of the world, were read more from an ethnographic, historical, anthropological perspective than as works of literature. It was very bad of them, right? So I would like to draw your attention to just the title of a 2003 article written by Ipshita Chanda. Her title is, "Can the Non-Western Comparatist Speak?" This is what I want to ask. Can the non-Western comparatist speak? The rebirth of comparative literature in the East, in other parts of the world, it happened because of this question. The non-Western comparatist started speaking, and the spectre of comparative literature took rebirth. What happened? Ganesh Devi, G.N. Devi, he says, the idea is to challenge the unconscious colonial desires of the West. He says, the unconscious colonial desires of the West, what does that do? Which perpetuate a situation where no Indian critic is taken seriously in Western literary circles. Whatever the Indian critics say, not accepted, because they are just area studies, not worthy of any attention. This was the way the Eurocentric Western man considered the Indian critics, says Ganesh Devi. And in 1998, Susan Bassett said something very interesting. She said that the objective of comparative literary studies is to undermine and undo the tendency of dominant cultures to appropriate emergent ones. Think about it. What was happening was, even as the death knell of comparative literature was ringing in the West, the opposite process was happening in the rest of the world. Comparative literature in Asia, in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, In all these places, comparative literature was gaining in strength and prominence. Comparative literature began to feature prominently in the syllabi of literary studies in the universities in all other parts of the world except the US and the Europe. Comparative literature started expanding wherever it was explicitly linked with questions of national identity and culture. This is something we have to understand. The original idea of comparative literature was as world comparative literature, as world literature, as against national literature. And the Western comparatist was always against the idea of national literature. They were speaking about world literature. They spoke about it, but they gave importance to European interests, that we know. Anyway, so comparative literature expanded in all other parts of the world, not by focusing on world literature, but by focusing on national literatures. Okay, so the idea is not of universalism. It's not universalism. Rather, it focused on something that the Western critics opposed vehemently. Always they were against this, the specificity of national literatures. You know what? Swapan Majumdar, the Indian critic, says, it is because of this predilection for national literature that comparative literature has struck roots in the third world nations and in India in particular. Because of the special liking for national literature, comparative literature has flourished in the third world countries and in countries like India. This is what Swapan Majumdar says. Exact opposite of what the comparatives said earlier. We should be against national literature. They said comparative literature is against national literature for the West, but in the East, in India, Swapan Majumdar says comparative literature took roots in third world because it was rooted in the interest in national literature. Ganesh Devi says something else. He suggests that comparative literature in India is directly linked to the rise of modern Indian nationalism, the nationalist feeling in India. He notes that comparative literature has been used to assert the national cultural identity. So, comparative literature is used by the critics from other parts of the world not to assert any universal values, not to assert the supremacy of European culture, not to assert any world literature, but to give importance to national cultural identity. At once it seemed incompatible, but the Indian critics, the Eastern critics made it possible. The shift in perspective is clearly evident. Earlier, comparative literature started with Western literature and looked outwards. Comparative literature, the West would use comparative literature as a lens to look at the outside world. Now what is happening is the West is being scrutinized from without. The West is being scrutinized from outside. It's very interesting. I will give you a few instances. You will find it very interesting. Swapan Majumdar goes to the extent of calling English, French, and German literatures as subnational literatures. Ganesh Devi had said that they didn't give any importance to Indian critics. Swapan Majumdar went on to call those critics, the German, the French, and English literatures as subnational literatures, not even national literature. Think of the courage, the boldness with which the Eastern comparatists were speaking. In Africa, the African writers led by Wole Soyinka questioned Hegel's notion and negation of Africa from history and civilization. I'm not sure if you are familiar with this idea, but Hegel wrote a book in 1899, Friedrich Hegel, titled The Philosophy of History. And he spoke about 4 major cultures and civilizations of the world. Curiously, he excluded African culture. He didn't consider African culture as a culture or a civilization. Hegel argued that Africa was unhistorical, that it did not have a history, that it was weak, undeveloped, that it was devoid of morality, values, religion, politics. In effect, Hegel was telling the Africans, you have no culture, you have no history. How painful it would have been for the African to listen to this. He denied Africa a history and culture. Hegel is important not because his ideas are correct, but because he represents the perception of a white European intellectual about Africa. The African writers pointed out that there were 2 Africas, one created by the Eurocentric lens of the West, and the other, the real Africa, if we can call it real, or the one invented and imagined as the other by the West, and the second, the real one that survives regardless of the misconceptions and denigrations of the West. So 2 Africas. Wole Soyinka won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. You know, he was the first Black African to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he titled his Nobel Prize lecture like this: "This past must address its present." This past, the past created by Hegel and the other Europeans, must address its present, must rectify the wrongs that you have committed towards us. Hegel, you know, in that speech, in that Nobel Prize speech, Wole Soyinka singled out Hegel for special treatment. He demolished the arguments of Hegel in the Nobel Prize speech. You know what? Also worth remembering, you know, would be Chinua Achebe, another Nigerian writer. He eloquently criticizes the racism in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I'm not going into that. You know, the title of that essay is "An Image of Africa: Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness." What is happening? The West is being scrutinized by the rest. The Indian, the African, the Caribbean, the Latin American, all these critics were scrutinizing the West from outside. And then there was Edward Said with his concept of Orientalism, rewriting the contours of literary and post-colonial theory in the late 20th century. So he was speaking about the other, right? You remember the other is everything that lies outside of the self. And Said said in a publication in 1978 publication, Hegel said, "The self is the familiar that is familiar to us, the European, the West, the us, and the other is strange, the Orient, the East, them." So I am self, I am good, I am the West, I am the Europe, and you, the other. You are strange, you are the East, you are them. Okay, othering. Something very interesting. You know what? The concept of self and other as a counterpart of it, I told you earlier, was propounded by Hegel himself, who said that Africa did not have a culture. So he propounded this idea of the self and the other. And Wole Soyinka, in his speech, in his Nobel Prize speech, spoke about the West's conception of Africa as the super other. Africa was conceived as the super other by the West, said Wole Soyinka. So he was using the same terms used by whom? used by Hegel to criticize Hegel. As Caliban would say, you taught me language and my profit on it is I know how to curse. Soyinka criticized and demolished Hegel by using Hegel's own words, the super other. Jean Longxi, in his essay, The Myth of the Other, China in the Eyes of the West, spoke about the West's conception of China as the ultimate other. Soyinka spoke about the West's conception of Africa as the super other, and Longxi speaks about the West's conception of China as the ultimate other. This then is the post-colonial avatar of comparative literature in the rest of the world. Here, comparative literature is used in a wonderfully constructive manner to explore indigenous traditions, to criticize imposed and imagined and imported traditions, and ultimately, this post-colonial comparative literature from the rest of the world clamors for a reconstituting of the literary canon. They are saying, you have filled the canon with your writers, European writers. Open the canon for our writers because we too belong. We are not the other, we too belong. The focus is well, and here the idea is comparative literature has changed completely. Once it was spoken of as world literature, now it is growing in every part, growing everywhere other than the US and the Europe, thanks to its focus on national literature. And to conclude, I would say it is in these national literatures that comparative literature would find its salvation and its repose. Thank you. So that ends the lecture. We shall take a few questions. If everybody isn't asleep, should I clap hands or has everybody left?
Hello, sir.
Yes,
Sir, can you
ma'am.
hear me, sir? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sir. Sir, sharing knowledge, I would start with a quote. I would like to start with a quote from my end, as usual. Sharing knowledge is the most fundamental act of a human being. So, because it is a way you can give something without losing something. A quote by Richard Stallman. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your wonderful expertise with us and also your wonderful perception, your learning on comparative literature. Now, I would like to move on to few questions asked by the participants, sir. Can I, sir?
Sure.
Yes. The first question is from Bhagya Lakshmi Venugopal. Ma'am was so happy listening to you. She has shared a question here. What are the responsibilities of a person involved in comparative literature?
Well, very good question. What should a comparatist do? I would rephrase that question like that. The thing that a comparatist has to do, obviously the comparatist has to look for similarities. When the comparatist is comparing texts or authors from different nationalities, cultures, the comparatist has to look for similarities and differences. But the important point is he shouldn't stop there. He shouldn't stop with finding out the similarities and differences. Rather, he should proceed on to an understanding of the underlying reasons for these similarities and differences. For example, if we find a similarity between an Indian writer and a writer from Canada, we have to explain that. A good comparatist is one who would find meaning out of that. He should make sense of it. He should explain why there is a similarity, why there is a difference. One common thing that most comparatives would say is human nature is unchanging. It is the same everywhere. So that is why an Indian writer and a Canadian writer share the same ideas. But beyond that, when we look at, that is where literary study actually starts. You will look into the biography of the author. You will look into historical elements. You will do new historical reading. All these things will happen, and you can apply a lot many theories to understand these texts, the differences they offer, the similarities that they throw into relief. All these things can be understood by using lot many literary theories. So it doesn't mean that comparative literature cannot have anything to do with other literary theories. The comparatist has to understand that comparison is the beginning. You begin with comparative, ultimately comparison is not the beginning, because we start with one literature. For example, I start with a particular author, and then while reading that particular author, I realize that, okay, this person's writing has very eerie similarities with that particular writer that I read recently. And so that is when I start moving towards comparative literature. But having explored the similarities and differences between these authors, I should not stop there. I should make better sense of it by using theoretical tools. It could be anything, but we should ask the questions why and how. Why there are these differences? Why there are these similarities? And we have to do that sort of an analysis. I would say this is the ultimate purpose. This is the ultimate responsibility of a comparatist, not to do a lot of theorizing. It killed comparative literature, not to do a lot of theorizing, but to do actual comparison. And in our country, there is a lot of comparative studies happening. We have a lot of PhD theses, a lot of MPhil dissertations. Even in MA dissertations, students come up with a lot of comparative studies. So it's very, it has a lot of potential. The comparatist has to explore those potential, those hidden potential, rather than worry about the scope and definition of comparative literature. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Second question from Benita Samuel. Is intertextuality a part of comparative literature?
Exactly. Very good. Intertextuality, it comes under a branch of comparative literature called influence studies. Influence study, the study of literary influence, how one particular writer has been influenced by another writer from another age. It could be a contemporary, it could be a writer from another age, another country. So literary influence. When you look at the concept of intertextuality propounded by Kristeva, see, intertextuality is actually not something new. Intertextuality, wherever we use any sort of literature, wherever we speak of literature, there is intertextuality, because there are traces of other texts, there are traces of other writers in whatever we say. Students ask me this question, sir, how can we avoid plagiarism completely? Because whatever I am saying will have been said by someone else. That is one way of looking at it. I don't blame the students. What the students say is true. It will be spoken of by someone else as well. Somebody else would have looked at it from that angle as well. And we cannot, if we say strictly, we cannot say anything new. And that is why intertextuality has been misused by some people. I guess in 2006 or 7, somebody was accused of plagiarism. A famous novel. It said that the news said that this lady had plagiarized large portion of her novel from another novel. And what she said was, no, I didn't plagiarize. It was just a case of intertextuality, influence. So yeah, intertextuality is, it can be seen as a subtype of influence studies. There is a emitter and a receiver. The emitter is the person whose influence is being received by the receiver. So if I am influenced by T.S. Eliot, then T.S. Eliot is the emitter and I am the receiver. And if you find traces of T.S. Eliot in my writing, that is intertextuality. So definitely any comparative study would would have recourse to intertextuality as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Professor Purnima. What's the status of comparative literature in the context of post-pandemic? Will it regain its lost glory and importance?
Well, actually, post-pandemic, the history of comparative literature tells that whenever there is a crisis, comparative literature has gained in strength. So if we consider this corona as an international crisis, this pandemic as a global crisis, then considering the history, considering the legacy of comparative literature is used to doing this. Whenever there is a crisis, comparative literature would come out on top. So in the wake of international crisis, idealistic visions will emerge of unity, of oneness, of staying together. Now, people are talking, when a celebrity committed suicide, we started talking about the importance to care for others. The farmer suicides could not do that, right? This is one way. And corona, we are looking at, when you look at the history of the webinars in the last 2 months, there was a huge spot of webinars. In the beginning, the webinars were an optional activity. Then the webinars became compulsory because the departments had to do that. The managements compelled the departments, and the teachers had to do some webinars because otherwise you cannot survive in this cutthroat world. So everything was, arranged. Somehow some lectures were arranged, webinars were conducted. And now what we are seeing is more and more we are moving away from subjects like literature or sociology or economics, and we are looking at the emotional well-being, right? We are looking at how the lockdown has impacted the emotional well-being of people. Sometimes we all feel mad, right? The lockdown has been imposed, and yesterday one of my friends was telling me lockdown was imposed, it was bad, and he took refuge in TikTok, and then TikTok was banned, so he doesn't know what to do now. So what is happening is the webinars are now looking at the emotional well-being of people. So psychiatrists, people like psychiatrists are leading sessions in webinars. So this change definitely hints that internationalist, idealist visions will soon emerge. And this could be very good for comparative literature from the Western perspective, the international perspective. But in the rest of the world, in Asia, in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, there is no problem with comparative literature. Comparative literature is doing fine. It is going great guns. So yeah, the future is bright for comparative literature, I would say, thanks to Corona.
Thank you so much, sir. The next question is from Rima. What are the parameters to be taken into consideration to compare writings of two authors?
Well, parameters when taking into consideration, see, one basic thing that we have to do is when we take two authors for comparison, there should be a fundamental raison d'etre. They call it the raison d'etre, a reason. And a reason should be there, a cause should be there as to why I am selecting these two writers. For example, I have a mobile here and I have a mouse here. Comparing these two will not make sense, will not make much sense, unless of course I can find something else. But if I compare this mobile with another mobile phone, that makes sense. The mobile phone made by one company with mobile phone made by another company, then there is a basis for comparison. Similarly, when we select authors, the first thing is there should be an implicit idea as to what is the basis for selecting these authors for comparison. So that we should have a reason. We should be able to substantiate the selection of authors. It should not be like we just randomly select two authors and do comparison. Yeah, we will, students will say, sir, when we select two authors who have nothing in common, it's very easy. I select one author from India and I select one author from Africa and I find out a lot of differences. Finished. My MA project is finished. No, that is not the, and that is not the spirit of comparative literature. The spirit of comparison is about having some basis for bringing those two people together, those two writers or those two literatures together, and then going into an exploration of the similarities and the differences. And of course, another thing that you have to look at when you do comparative study, another parameter I would say would be to limit your scope. We need to have a limited scope. Even for a PhD, if you are doing a comparative study of two authors, your scope is so vast. You have to study a lot of writers, a lot of writings, you are comparing two writers who have written 10 novels each. You have to study 20 novels. So some people take too many authors and too many texts for comparison. And this breadth, this vastness of subject area will really affect comparative literature. So one another parameter to take into consideration should be to limit the scope so that we can do a proper analysis, and that is regarding the scope. And thirdly, another parameter regarding the methodology, how to go about this practice of comparing these two writers. What should be my framework? What should be the points that I should be looking at? We should have a clearly defined idea, what they call a thesis statement, and they speak about research questions. When we speak about research questions in a research, in a comparative study, we have to clearly spell out our methodology, our purpose for this comparison. And if those things are properly laid out, the comparative study will proceed smooth. So I would say that these are the major parameters. Of course, you need to have a very good understanding of comparative literature and its theories. You have to know thematology, you have to know genealogy, you have to know influence and parallel study, pastiche. All these things will have to be studied thoroughly before you enter into a comparative study. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to go with last two questions. The next question is, do gender studies have any role in fine-tuning comparative literature?
Well, gender studies, can it fine-tune comparative literature? Why not? Why not? Gender studies actually was one of the culprits behind the delegitimation of comparative literature as an academic discipline. Gender studies, we normally don't usually consider feminism or gender studies as a post-structuralist theory. We think that feminism existed since long, but that is not the case. Feminism or gender studies is actually based on the post-structuralist notion. The notions propounded by Derrida when he spoke about the center, the margin, and the periphery, and play. Feminism, gender studies, what it tries to do is, earlier the man was at the center, and feminism, gender studies, they try to say that no, this is not right. It is not right to keep man at the center and women at the margins. No, that is not proper. So we do a deconstructive study, we do a post-structuralist study, and what we do is we subvert this system, what Derrida would call reinscription, free play and reinscription. So the center becomes unstable, and what mostly happens is we try to put women at the center. There is a system where men was at the center and women was at the margins. we said this is not right. Feminism and gender studies, we said that this is not right. We want to have women coming to the foreground. So we put women at the center and we take men to the margins. No, this is not what Derrida wanted. Derrida wanted us to completely do away with this way of understanding of things in terms of center and margin and periphery and play. In other words, see, it doesn't matter who is at the center and who is at the margins, whether woman is at the center or man is at the center. If somebody else is in the margins, then this system is not okay. Now, what I'm saying is we have to do away with this sort of thinking. And, gender studies, what actually happens is, very recently somebody was talking about a comparative gender study. I hope she is listening to this lecture as well. So she was telling me, I shouldn't tell her idea because that is her own idea, but a comparative gender study. Culturals, we are speaking about comparative cultural studies. So there is definitely scope for comparative gender studies as well. Think about it, how comparative gender studies can be suitably accomplished. And when we do that, definitely it will help us to do away with this sort of thinking of things in terms of center and margin. So I don't know whether gender studies can fine tune or anything, do some manipulation with comparative literature. But yeah, there is a scope for bringing gender studies and comparative literature together.
Thank you, sir. One final question for the day. Can we conduct a comparative literature study between the tragic and the comedy genres, with null equivalence or nil common denominator?
Study between runners is common in comparative literature. Study between genres, we speak about genealogy. The study comparing genres. So when you say that tragedy and comedy, can we compare tragedy and comedy because they have nothing in common? I don't agree. I don't agree that there is nothing common between a tragedy and a comedy. There are so many things in common between a tragedy and a comedy. Think about it. Both are types of dramas, right? Both are types of plays. Both, the definition of a tragedy. Tragedy is defined as, let us recall Aristotle's definition of tragedy and let us see how many of those features can be applied to a comedy. And then you will agree to me that there are common things between tragedy and comedy. Aristotle defines tragedy as the imitation of an action. Comedy is also the imitation of an action. Aristotle continues, that is serious. No, comedy is not always serious, but there are serious comedies as well. If you think about comedy as something that ends happily, a play that, if you look at a play that ends happily as a comedy, then it can be serious. So there are gray areas. That is serious, Aristotle continues, complete in itself. A comedy should also be complete in itself to be considered a comedy. It should be complete in itself. So that is applicable to, out of three, two factors are applicable to tragedy, comedy as well. Tragedy is the imitation of an action. One, that is serious. Okay, ignore serious, complete in itself, and of a certain magnitude. Okay. And of a certain magnitude. That also applies for comedy. In an embellished language. We may not always use very poetic language for a comedy, but there are comedies written in very poetic, very ornate language as well. So that is also fine with comedy. A comedy can be written using all these things in an embellished language through action. Fifth point, fifth similarity, in comedy too we need action. Aristotle's definition of tragedy, through action. And sixth point, no and not through narration. No, a comedy can also be cannot also be narrated. It has to be staged. Okay, and then he says through pity and fear, evoking a catharsis of these and such like emotions. There are emotions in comedy as well. Parada speaks about hasya as a sthayi bhava, and humor as a, hasya, hasa as a laughter, as a rasa, and it's sthayi bhava. Parada speaks about that. So that is also an emotion. There are emotions. So if you just compare the very definition of tragedy, you will find so many things in common with comedy. So what I would say is, don't say that there are nothing in common. We have to be, we are literature people, so we have to be a little imaginative. I had never thought about this question, this idea, but we can find lot of such similarities. If you do an actual study, go to definitions, go to the fundamental premises that make a tragedy and a comedy. A tragedy needs to have characters, a tragedy needs a plot, comedy needs characters, comedy needs plot, tragedy has dialogue, comedy has dialogue. Think of the 6 elements of a tragedy as spoken by Aristotle, or the latest ways of looking at tragedy and comedy. Everywhere we find a lot of connection, a lot of similarity. So I wouldn't say that there is nothing to compare. There are a lot of similarities between these two entities called tragedy and comedy, and that is why Shakespeare blended it into tragicomedy. And that was why Dr. Johnson said, defending Shakespeare in his preface to Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson said, life is a web of joys and sorrows. Life is a web of tragedies and comedies. And if literature is a reflection of life, is a mirror held up to nature, then that reflection of life should include both tragedy and comedy. So let us be open to it. And I understand the essence of the question. What if there are no similarity between the two things that we are comparing? Well, in that case, the basic premise is missing. There should be a basic idea basic principle that should govern the selection of two things for comparison. And in an altogether different sphere, we say that we shouldn't do comparison. Don't compare your child with the neighbor's child. We say that. So comparison has its benefits, comparison has its demerits as well. It all depends on how we do it, for what purpose we do it. That's the idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Over to Professor Shivram.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
So, very good afternoon to one all present here. I would like to propose my vote of thanks. What we do for ourselves dies with us. What we do for others and the world remains, and it is immortal. So I think this quote perfectly suits the speaker of today and today's session. So what you had with you had shared it with us, and I feel that it will remain with us and it will be immortal. So it's my proud privilege to propose a vote of thanks to you, sir, on behalf of the Department of English and aided PhD College of Arts and Science and our diverse audience. I extend my hearty vote of thanks to you, sir. Today's session was like a storytelling where the hero was
Comparative literature.
comparative literature. You have personified comparative literature. You told about its birth, its death, its resurrection, and what is its scope. And you had given beautiful examples starting from Ezra Pound about a chemical reaction, how it reacts, and then you told the etymology and definition of comparative literature, and you explained to us how juxtaposition and translation are the tools of comparative literature, and you gave Goethe's quote about poetry, how the universal values make the wealth literature. and how Arnold baptized comparative literature, then how it has become, how it has come to the universities as a discipline, and then how it became Eurocentric. Then you also told about how comparative literature proposed to be world literature, then the tragedy of life and death of comparative literature, how the beat movement was an interlude to this comparative literature. Then you talked about the history of comparative literature, then how it was lost in literary theory, how Susan Barnett resurrected it, then how comparative literature became a branch of something that is translation studies, and how in 2003 Gayatri Spivak gave the death of this discipline, then how she has changed it into comparative cultural studies. Then you told about the reasons for the death of cultural studies. Then you had I mean, at the epilogue, you have concluded with your topic, that is, what is the spectral rebirth of comparative literature, and how the non-Western started to speak about comparative literature. Then finally, how comparative literature can be a national literature. So it was so nice to listen to you, sir. And
Thank you
now
so
I
much.
think, with no doubt, I can say that why in your marital status you have quoted it as married to literature. I think it's not only me, but all the audience would accept, or anyone who has listened to your lecture would accept that, yes, this gentleman is married to literature. Such vast knowledge and such clear explanation you have given today to us about comparative literature, sir. And with no doubt, I can just say that, yes, sir, you are married to literature. Thank you for the wonderful session, and thank you for sparing your knowledge and time with us, sir.
Thank you. I would just like to thank the organizers, Professor Shivaram, the head of the Department of English, Deepthi ma'am, then Pavitra ma'am, all those who have helped me, who have welcomed me, who have given me a nice feeling of being at home with PSG, and who have given me this opportunity. I would also like to thank our audience, whoever listened to this lecture, whoever attended to it over YouTube, over Google Meet. I would like to thank you all for your wonderful cooperation, wonderful support, and your participation, your untiring, sleepless cooperation right through this lecture. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. That's it from me. So I sign off. So I guess I can leave.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
With your permission, I would just like to send a message to the audience. They